acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. If you haven't already done so, now is the time to please turn your phones to silent. But please do feel free to engage in any form of social media. If you are tweeting, we are at Avid Reader 4101. On behalf of everyone at Avid Reader, it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting Indrani's launch. She is a delightful part of the Avid ecosystem, and we are very proud to celebrate her contribution to Brisbane's own literary scene. Indrani Ganguly was born of Bengali parents in Lucknow, India. Her parents imbued her with a strong sense of Indian and world history and culture, and a great appreciation of diversity in all of its forms. Indrani studied English Honours and Sociology in India and did her PhD on the impact of British occupation on revolution and reform in West Bengal from the Australian National University. She has worked in academia, publishing and diverse government and non-government organisations, and as a volunteer committee member in many community organisations. In 1990, Indrani married an Australian with whom she now lives in Brisbane. They have a son, a daughter and a grandson. Tonight, Indrani will be in conversation with Sarah Muller, a Brisbane poet who has published 2 books, Meditations of a Left-Hander and Journal of a Wandering Seer. Her poetry has been published widely in Queensland. She is passionate on sharing different perspectives and ways of seeing the world. Please join me in welcoming Sarah and Indrani.
Is that okay? It's a privilege to be in conversation with Indrani about her new novel, The Rose and the Thorn. I first met Indrani about 3 decades ago when we were both staying to work at Queensland Health. I clearly remember our first meeting. Indrani gave me a leaflet about a women's mental health conference in Brisbane, and that was the start of our friendship, with Indrani continuing to expand my horizons. We both share a love of poetry, and Indrani introduced me to the Society of Women Writers and the Fellowship of Australian Writers, which greatly helped both of us develop our writing and gave us publishing opportunities. I would often go to events to hear Indrani perform her poetry publicly, which was a strong source of inspiration for me and encouraged me to go on that path. Recently, Indrani has joined my book club and is a wonderful contributor with her rich and deep knowledge and insight into the world. At the moment, we're writing a zine together, sharing our perspectives and philosophies on life. So Indrani has been a wonderful mentor and friend to me. So I'll just say a few words about the book before I introduce Indrani. I love the opening of the book, where Mukti is in the garden brandishing a sword, and she's a strong warrior queen. And it brought back memories of me as a kid in our own garden behaving in a similar way. So I immediately connected with the book. One thing I loved about the book was the great characterisation. The 2 key characters are twin sisters, Mukti and Lila. Both are very different from each other, but both have very strong characters. So Mukti was strong-minded, determined, forthright, curious, questioning, and a free spirit. Lila was a lover of words, poetry, and writing. She was sensitive, feeling, observant, and had an ability to get on with all kinds of people. Their father, Jay, was intelligent and a highly wise man. An interesting balance to the story was their friendship with 2 English people, Elizabeth and Alan. And Alan was great friends with Jay, and like Jay, was wise and scholarly. So I love the messages of the novel, which for me are: have the courage to forge your own path in life, and a feeling of deep acceptance of who you are in all your uniqueness. So Indrani, congratulations on the book. It's an impressive achievement. And before we do the questioning and answering, I'd like you to say a bit about your background.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's lovely to see so many people that I haven't met for a long time, and lovely to see some people that I don't know, and I hope you find this an interesting and worthwhile event to come to. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the elders from every community that we have here or who are here with me in spirit. And I'd like to acknowledge three very special elders in my own life. My dad, who believed girls can do anything, and my maternal grandfather and grandmother, who provided much inspiration for the book, although it's not their story. And my relatives have been warned that they're not to come to me and say, why did you write about your grandmother like this, or did your dad really do this, or whatever. About myself, you've had a bit of an introduction about me. So I'm an only child. My family comes from the east. We are Bengalis, and I'm stressing the Bengali because every state in India has its own culture, its own language, and its own idiosyncrasies, I guess, so which is why it's called the subcontinent. I was brought up in a conservative Bengali Brahmin family, but I could see the pace of change right from my great-grandmother onwards. And I was told I've met my great-great-grandmother, but I think I was 6 months old, so I don't remember that. I'm just going to tell you what I remember. We moved around a lot, which was great because every state had its own language and culture. And to avoid my having to learn more than 4 languages in school, my parents sent me to a convent school, where they taught you in English and had much the same curriculum. But that was a different world again, and my parents were very liberal, so it was quite okay for me to sing Jesus Wants Me to Be a Sunbeam along with all the more patriotic songs and things. So that was my background. I guess it was a good way of being able to deal with complexity, contradictions, and India is full of its diversity, and a good way to come to Australia because already had there was a lot to learn, but there was already something already there that helped me. I might stop at this point, and people can always ask me questions later on.
Thanks, Indrani, for your rich and deep insight to give us understanding for how you approach the book and the background. So I'll start with the first question. How did you come across the theme, and what inspired the book?
Just one way. Are people okay with us standing up? Because we've asked to sit down, but we actually feel more comfortable just walking around and moving around a bit. And if you can't hear me or if I'm talking too fast, please let me know. To get back to the question, I like to use this analogy, and bear with me those who've heard it before, that this book is like one of these Australian trees where the seeds lay dormant for many, many years until they have the right condition, and then they germinate and grow into big trees. So I think the book is like that. The first seeds were sown when I was doing my research for my thesis, which was on the impact of British occupation on the part of India my mother's family comes from. And this was a small principality ruled by a big landlord with the grandiose title of Maharaja. He was not an emperor, but he had that title. And I was, among other things, I was really interested in exploring what was the role of women in this period, which is 1900 to 1947, because this was when a lot of women became involved in the national movement and also social reform. One of the great things about our Indian leaders, I thought, is that they didn't want the British, but they also recognized that we had many forms of inequities in our own society. So gender, caste, class, religion, you name it, we had it. And they felt that if we were to be a truly independent nation, we had to deal with it at both ends. Now, I was aware of all the high-flying women who were involved in both these movements, but I couldn't find anything about the more ordinary women who were the base. It's the ordinary people who are the base of any movement, of any society. So we have our Indian battlers, just as you have your Aussie battlers. And all I could get was some anecdotal stories from my grandmother and a couple of elderly people in the city. And because this was for a PhD thesis, I needed to have some documentation or a bit more information in depth. So I couldn't use it for the thesis, but I tucked the ideas away for use at a later time, if the opportunity presented itself. When I finished my thesis, I did a short stint in publishing, and then was headhunted to lead the research and publishing unit of a big non-government organization in Delhi, which is where I lived. And apart from the work, and I learned heaps, I got the opportunity to meet many different women. There were, first of all, the women engaged in fighting for women's rights, whether it was for employment, whether it was for education, depending on the background of the women, and also women's safety, both at home and on the streets. I met a lot of other women, or sometimes it was the same women, who believed that yes, we have to talk about issues, but we also have to develop a strengths-based approach where we talk about what have women achieved, because everyone needs some role models to aspire for, and role models that look and sound like you. So while we knew about the suffragettes and Germaine Greer and Betty Friedan, they didn't look and sound like us. Their issues were not necessarily. So these were the women who started delving into what have women written, and they went back 3,000 years. They established the first feminist press in India called Kali for Women, and journals, and started recording the history. And the third group that I met was all the whole plethora of people who've become involved in issues in the so-called developing world, and these were the aid agencies, the missionaries, journalists, and the students. Like any group, they were a mix of the good and not so good. I have warm memories of some of the students that I was asked to supervise, not so good memories of some of the others. But the one that stuck in my head was this Canadian journalist who got quite frustrated that we wouldn't admit to have been oppressed from birth till, you know, with whatever, because we saw the better side of India. Yes, we were aware of it. And when we finally said, you know, why are you painting such a one-sided portrait? And she got really defensive and said, oh, I don't see why it matters to you. You're never going to see what I write. And we thought this was rather unethical, so we told her to go away and invent whatever she wanted to. But it did struck me that, yes, we don't have a control over what other people say or write about us, but we can start contributing to the dialogue and do our own writing and start telling our own stories. At that point, I was still publishing stuff from my academic book, and I started helping some of the women's centers in refining their reports. But I also started collecting some information, keeping in mind, you know, the ideas that had been stirred up when I was doing the research. I forgot to say, it was not just about the role in the national movement and social reform. My grandfather, who was a great old gossip and knew exactly who was going around with whom, in a very conservative, told me some rather amazing stories, and that was at the back of my head as well. Anyway, this was the baggage that I came with when I came to Australia in 1990. I got my first job in a feminist organization, great opportunity to learn a lot about what was happening, but also to become aware of how we were perceived here. And I think for Indian women, we're either these exotic people or we're the oppressed people, and I didn't like either box, you know, so I said I like my own, I don't want to be in any box. But it was a great way of starting to think about, you know, how do I, you know, don't get mad, get even. My way of getting even is to write about it. And some of it was quite funny. I can remember one colleague coming in and trying to get me into a discussion about auras, and she had been told she had a very boring aura, and I said, I don't believe in auras. And she said, oh dear, you've really been corrupted by Western culture. That really threw me, because I would have expected my community to say that, not. And the others, of course, thought, since I'm married to a white guy, that had been saved by Western culture, but I had no gory stories of, you know, I wasn't a child bride, there was no dowry extortion, I couldn't remember any DV, so I don't think I quite fitted into that box either, but that was okay. We stayed friends, we just agreed to disagree. At this time, I also joined a couple of writers groups, and that's how I met Sarah, and I started using some of this information into writing poems and short stories. And I wrote my first short story based on this anecdote my grandfather told me, and I'll come back to it later, called The Rose and the Thorn. And it was about the relationship between two sisters and some of the somewhat unconventional relationships they had with the guys in their family and the ones they met. And one of my writer friends said, wow, this looks like it could be a good novel. So after the first freaking out, I've never written a novel in my life, how am I going to do it? I said, well, that's a challenge. And that's how it all started.
Thanks, Indrani. I love your celebration of strong females, and you have so much passion in describing it. So thank you, Indrani. The next question is, are the characters based on anyone in your family?
No, they are based on a mix of some real life figures, people I've read about, and the story. The real life figures was first of all Indira Gandhi, who was thrown into the fray at the age of 5. She had grandfather, father, mother, aunts, everyone involved in the national movement. And at the age of 5, she describes how she was told that you have to burn everything that's made in Britain. We have to revive the Indian industries. The only things that are exempt are books, because books are sacred. We do not burn books. So she describes how, with great sorrow, she burnt her her doll, which came from Britain. But I thought for a 5-year-old, at the age of 10, she established the Monkey Brigade, or the Vanar Sena, and that was young children, which at its height it was 60,000 young people, and they helped to take secret messages, post letters, do all the things that they wouldn't be suspected of doing. And there's a story that she had these secret documents in the boot of her car and was stopped by the policeman, and she told the policeman, "I'm getting late for school, you can't stop me. If you stop me, you have to go and talk to the principal," and they let her through. So I thought that was, because Mukti is quite young when there are the queens and everything, but these are real women. The second one was Lila, is based loosely on Sarojini Naidu, who also was one of our famous leaders, known for her poetry, her politics, her wit. She was called the jester in Gandhi's court. She was also known for keeping Gandhi in his place. So she's always there by his side. She's never behind him when they had the great marches. And so it's bits of this. The real story is from this anecdote my grandfather told me. I should explain I'm just going to get a drink of water. We were just going for a walk. He was going to introduce me to some of the important people in the town. And he said, there's X. He's had an interesting life because I should explain, in many Hindu families, there is what we call a joking relationship, and that's husband with his wife's younger sister and wife with the husband's younger brother. Now, it's just jokes. It's not supposed to go beyond anyone. But he said, this guy really didn't know when to stop, and he had an affair with his wife's younger sister and got her pregnant. And the wife, I said, well, what happened? And he said, the wife said, well, you'll have to get divorced and marry her because she can't be an unmarried mother, not in India, and made her sign over the house to him. So the ex-wife lived upstairs, the husband and sister lived downstairs. And I said, well, didn't anyone say anything? And she said, no, they're family. Family has to stick together. Now, this could not have happened in the period that I am writing about because divorce became legal only in 1955. But families did stick together, and he told me a few other stories. So I thought, well, that's what was part of this story, that things like this happen. Not everybody is subjected to honor killings and all that, and many middle-class families do come together to protect their own, at least in the circle that I'm familiar with. There are a couple of others. There's a strong friendship between Joy, the male lead, and the Englishman Alan, and this is loosely based on the friendship between Gandhi and a Jesuit priest, Father Andrews. Father Andrews was one of the many people who persuaded Gandhi to come back from South Africa to India, and he was quite involved, and he went to Fiji as well. And until 1935, when Gandhi told Father Andrews, I think it's better you leave saving India to the Indians. So Father Andrews went back to England and spent the rest of his life battling in the conflict between his Jesuit beliefs and the fight for social justice. But he is very well respected in India. He's got a name, Deen Bandhu, meaning friend of the poor. So there was no hostility to him. Some of the other things that people might think improbable in what is still a very conservative society is the Hindu woman marrying a Muslim, Now there was one of the nationalist leaders, Aruna Ganguly, same no relation. She married a Muslim, and family was not happy with that, because not only was he a Muslim, but he was 20 years older, and I think the fact of him being 20 years older seemed to rankle more, and there are many others. So as I said, it's not about any particular person, it's just drawing inspiration. The pace of change within our families is based on what I actually heard about, saw, or observed. So the first barrier to be broken was education. Everybody in my family, from my great-grandmother, was educated, but only till school, and they did music and things, but they didn't go to university. My mother was the last one who didn't go to university, but that was by choice. She could have done it after she got married, but she chose to do music and theatre. Everyone else since then, and now if you don't go to university, you're considered a bit of an oddball. The other big thing was marriage, the right to choose who you marry. Now, whether your parents dig someone up or you find someone, that's immaterial. It is really, and that came about in my uncle, when my mother's generation, when my uncle married a Scotswoman. He's too frightened to tell his mother for a few years, till my grandmother said, please put your mother out of her misery. You know, you've got kids. We don't know what the Scottish side thought of it, because I never met them. So there are all those. And now then career, that came in with my aunts choosing to have a career. And from there it's been, and now the aunts and uncles are grumbling about children who expect them to find them a partner rather than doing it themselves. So I would like to say that I am conscious that we still have a lot of gender inequities. We are part of a minority perhaps, but it's a very large minority because it's a very big population, and it's important to keep the minorities in mind as well, because they are part of the whole society, and maybe and there's a lot of things happening that we don't know about.
Thanks, Indrani. You've given us really rich insights into the history of family dynamics. So we'll go on to the next question. There are 3 symbols in the book that I noticed. The rose is explained in the book, the building on the cover of the book, and the mother goddess. Could you explain them?
Yeah, the rose, it's explained in the book, so I won't go into that. The building is the Bara Imambara. The first, it's not the Taj Mahal. I said no to the Taj Mahal. It's on everything from chocolate boxes to but the Bara Imambara, Lucknow, I should explain, which is one of the places where the story is situated, is a place noted for its very refined Muslim rulers, its great courtesy of manners, and its food and textiles. Now, the Bara Imambara was actually built in the 18th century when there was a big famine, and the ruler said, well, he's not going to hand out money. So he got the poor people to start building it, and every evening the rich people would come and tear it down. So that meant they had employment for the 10 years. So that was kind of work for the dole before that became. And I think that lends it to, you know, that there were some Indians who were concerned about injustice, inequities, and how do you look for a better distribution of things. But the other amazing thing about the Imambara is that it's got this fascinating maze, and you never know where you're going or where you're going to land up. And in a way, that kind of was a symbol for my book, because the secret of the Imambara is when you think you're going up, you're actually going down. And when you think you're going down, you're actually going up. So the way to get out is to follow the light and go down. And I thought that was the journey for the book, because every time I thought I'd reached a certain point, I had to find another way. The third one is the mother goddess, Durga, and I did say I'm from Bengal, and Bengal is noted for a couple of things. One is that the worship of the mother goddesses has always been more important than that of the male gods. But Durga, Bengal was also the seat of 2 different kinds of national movement. One was the more militant kind, and one was the more peaceful kind that was much bigger. And the militants actually used Durga as their symbol, because the goddess has two sides. She is the benign mother with her family. She is also the fierce goddess who the gods call upon to defeat the demons when they can't do anything. So they hand over their arms to her and say, hey, you go and deal with it. And that became the symbol, Mother Goddess, Mother India. So that was the rallying cry. The other thing was, originally the worship of Durga was in the rich people's houses, and in the which of course then precluded all the poor people, because they're not going to wander into the rich person's house. And a group of people thought, well, the goddess is for everybody, why is she stuck in somebody's house? So they pulled out the celebrations out into the open, and that has continued. So it's never in a temple or anyone's house, it's always in an open public space, even here, and anyone is free to attend. The other remarkable thing is Bengali Hindus and Muslims have never had the kind of that level of antagonism which we see elsewhere, and Bengali Muslims have always attended the worship of the Mother Goddess, and they do so even here in Brisbane. So I think it was all that. One thing I should explain is many Hindu families have their own domestic shrine, which is the woman's, generally the woman's space. And my grandmother, who had a very practical approach to Hinduism, said, well, look, if I told someone I want to go and sit by myself, they'll think there's something wrong. In those days, remember, women didn't have a room of their own. If I say I'm going to pray and meditate, it doesn't matter if I sit there for half the day. And that was, of course, where they also had the sweets and the other things. And I spent many hours sitting there. And so, yeah, that's the symbology of those three.
Thanks, Indrani. I love the notion of going down the dark to find the light, and it reminds me of the part of the book which is about 2/3 into the book, where Mukti's in jail after marching for independence, and you really wonder how the novel's going to unravel at that point. It's a key moment in the novel. But we'll go on to the next question. How long did it take to write the book?
On and off, about 10 years. So there were long, as I said, I kept going up and I wasn't actually getting out or down. I do come from an academic background. Since this is historical fiction, I was quite clear that it had to be based on things that could have happened, whether they actually happened or something, but it had to be based on solid fact. And here there was one question raised. There is a sex worker and she gets involved. But that is also fact, because the Bengal National Congress, they had actually inducted a group of sex workers to help with volunteer work, and Gandhi jumped up and down and said, no, we don't want these kind of women. But the Bengalis stuck firm, and they did. Well, keep in mind, this is 1930s, 1940s, so that also did happen. Sometimes it's actually quite funny. I didn't actually know what was happening inside the prison, but I knew there would be, so I wrote up something where women of all classes were clumped together, and of course there were women who would normally not have mixed in real life, and suddenly here are these upper class and middle class women clumped together with women who were illiterate, from the streets, from anywhere. And I just wrote up about what could have happened. Some got along, some didn't, but some of the women actually did start up literacy classes. And then towards the end of the novel, I went back to India and I found a book about women, and there was a chapter on women in the colonial prison, and it was very much what I thought. So that was an affirmation that yes, maybe. So that was it. But yes, there was a time when I had a beginning and an end and no middle. The middle took the most amount of time.
Thank you, Indrani. I think we'd all say we'd admire her perseverance for 10 years to produce this brilliant book. So thanks. What did you find most difficult in writing the book?
Just to get started and to scope it out, because I knew I wanted to explore three dimensions: the national movement, social reform, and what was happening in the domestic sphere. And I first thought maybe I should cross one out, and but then all three aspects seemed so intertwined in the lives of my characters so I thought, well, I'm just going to have to somehow manage to do it, and that's another reason why it took so long. There was a question of making the characters believable. I could say roughly that the Indian ones would be, but what about the English ones? Because there was even less information about the average English woman in India. But I did find some good resources in the State Library here, and some fascinating stories, like when they went back to England, they had a custom of throwing the hats into the sea. If the hat sank, it meant they didn't have to come back. Because remember, a lot of them were only there because they were married to, and some would put coins in the hat, so it sank. And all kinds of these little things. And yes, I mean, I don't think I would underestimate how difficult it must have been for these women who are often coming from small country towns or whatever in England or Scotland or wherever, and then coming to a totally different, and they didn't have the employment that the men would have had to, you know, get over those. There are probably similar stories here, maybe of the early days.
What did you enjoy about or gain from writing this book?
Well, first of all, learning a lot about the history. There were many things I didn't know myself. I knew about the high flyers, as I said, but I didn't know that the Queen of Lucknow, she was the Muslim, Hazrat Mahal, because we heard about the Rani of Jhansi. There's a famous poem, and my Indian friends there will know what I'm talking about, and the stirring image of the Rani of Jhansi riding into battle to save her empire with the sun strapped to her back, and she was killed. But Hazrat Mahal also stood up, but she was defeated, and she died in exile in Nepal. I didn't know about that. There were all kinds of family histories. As I said, my grandfather made me sort of open my eyes about what could happen and did happen behind the scenes. So maybe I learned a bit about myself as well. There were lots of assumptions that I made when I started it, and I had to question my own assumptions. I didn't know a lot about what the so-called working class women and their role, because we had only learned about the middle class women. So there was all that as well. So it's learning about your own self as well.
That sounds great, Indrani, learning about yourself through writing. I think that just sounds absolutely wonderful. But what are some of the key messages you'd like readers to take away from the book?
Well, one is that all societies, whether it's India or Australia, are complex and contradictory, and so are all people. That's the thing of the rose and the thorn. We have a dark side and we have a light side. For India, we have an old cliche that whatever you say about us is true, and so is its opposite. And I don't know if there's an equivalent for Australia. I think it's learning a bit about history, perhaps a bit about shared history, because we were two arms of the British Empire, and I think it does go below the cricket and all the superficial one thing. So, you know, maybe it would stir up a bit more interest in Indian writers beyond the ones, you know, like Arundhati Roy and whatever. So that's what I'd like to. And, you know, women do overcome quite great odds, and what they do need is the personality. They need the resources and they need the support. If you don't have at least two of these, it is difficult. I mean, let's not romanticize the barriers that women everywhere have to face.
I love when I talk to Indrani that you learn about the complexity of Indian mythology, and I love Indrani's complex way of understanding it and her passion in sharing her deep knowledge on this. So we come to the last question, Indrani. Where to from here? Is there going to be another book, or?
Yes, there is, because there is a daughter in the book, and the last sentence is that she's traveled many paths, but that's another story. So, because this is already 300 odd pages, and I thought, you know, I'm not going to. So yes, I've only written one chapter, and then I thought I've got to get this out of my head before. But it's, I know the themes. I haven't got a story to hang it on to, and as with this book, I wasn't out to write a textbook on history and sociology. It has to be a story. So that's it.
Well, look, congratulations, Indrani. It's a massive achievement. It's I love how she's woven history into personal stories, and what I found in reading the book, it's a great meditative read. You really get drawn into the family dynamics, which is then put in the broader framework of the historical period of Indian independence. So it's a highly knowledgeable, insightful and inspiring book, and enlightening. So congratulations, Indrani. It's a huge achievement. So let's give her
thank you all very much. I don't know if you mentioned, Sarah, that you had the joy of reading the first very rough drafts.
Indrani, it's always a joy to read your book, as is always to talk to you. It's always enlightening. As I said, Indrani always expands you. She always expands your thinking, your horizons, and your knowledge and understanding of things. She, like Mukti, speaks her mind. And when I was reading the book, when Mukti was being very assertive, I was thinking, that could be Indrani. I could see Indrani in Mukti's forthright, strong-minded character, but also the other key character, Lila, has a more gentler, softer side, and sometimes you can see that side to Indrani with her love of poetry and sharing her ideas and feelings and understanding of the world and all of us in it. So Indrani, thanks a lot. I think we're going to open it up to questions.
Sure. I'm not sure if we... Are you going to take the mic around? I'm happy to come and stand there if it's easier for people.
Thank you, Indrani. Just more of a statement. Maybe the Aussie equivalent is you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl.
I'll keep that in mind, because in the next novel I want to draw the Australian and the Indian connections. So that's one thing for me to keep in mind.
I hope the next book isn't 10 years in the making.
No.
So we can follow through with the story. Thank you.
Good evening, Indrani. For the past many years you've been living on our island. I was wondering how the view from our island back to the subcontinent has changed your views of your home. Original.
Well, I don't like cricket, so I don't care who wins. I think when you come overseas and you see how people perceive us, that of course changes. Some things I agree with, some things I don't. It's a bit difficult to get down to specifics because now I see myself as part of both countries, so I haven't distanced myself from India, but I also consider myself part of Australia. It's always fascinating to look at points of connection because people talk of cultural conflict, but I believe in cultural negotiation, that many of us learn to negotiate between the country of origin and the country of settlement. After all, I wasn't forced to come here, I came of my own choice. There are negatives in India that you become more, when you're there you don't pay much attention to it, perhaps see them more clearly from here and vice versa. So it's not a very clear black and white kind of thing, but it is important to see how the outside world perceives India, because otherwise you get complacent, or you don't have to accept everything. But we have a saying that it is always better to have a clever enemy than a foolish friend, because the clever enemy forces you to think and sharpen your own rationale. The foolish friend makes you complacent. I know I waffled a bit, but I can't give you a very direct answer. I don't regret at all being from India, because as I...
The resolution of that question in the next book.
But I think it's a great privilege to be part of two great nations.
Yeah.
And as I said, I come from the background where we were fortunate to be able to tap into the good side of India, which doesn't mean we weren't aware of the negative sides, and there's many, but you draw on the strengths to deal with the dark side, and sometimes you need to be here at a distance to be able to work out how to deal with that.
I have a question, Indrani. First of all, I'd like to say I've read the book and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so I've known you for a number of years. This is definitely Indrani on a page.
It's not my story though.
No, but I see the sociologist early on, and I did wonder, of course, about how autobiographical it might have been. But my question really is this: you've written a doctoral dissertation, and now you've written a historical novel. So what was different and what was the same about those two processes?
The doctoral dissertation had to be based on very sound evidence, and because it was from a history department, I had to have the documentation, which is why I couldn't use the anecdotal information. The novel, there was a bit more leeway with, and that's why the second town is actually a fictional town. It draws bits and pieces from the doctoral dissertation, but it's not that city, because I thought some of the people still live there. What if they read it and then think, you know, do I really know this person, or did they behave like that? So I took that liberty. You can't do that in the doctoral, but the doctoral was a great help in thinking about how to structure things in the novel. There are different kinds of writing. There's much more structure right from the outset in a doctoral dissertation. With the novel, you have to weave a story and I hope it reads like a story and not like a textbook. And I've used a lot of dialogue for that, because I like to imagine how my characters think rather than have pages and pages of description, which is where the boundaries might have got blurred.
Indrani, you've written a novel in English, and from your talking, you were saying that you were educated in English at a convent school. What language did you use at home in your family?
I can't see you, so
just me and Indrani.
Sorry.
I was curious. Well, I suppose it relates. Hi, you know, to the language spoken within your home and among your women ancestors. You yourself were educated in English, and you've written your novel in English. So it must feel like a mother tongue to you. I'm curious your take on language and identity, you know, and expression.
Well, my first language or mother tongue is Bengali, and my second language is Hindi, and English is my third language. But for writing, it's become the first language because that's what I was educated in. With my female ancestors, most of them could speak at least two languages, Bengali and Hindi. We don't have, and the later ones, my aunts, they spoke English as well. You didn't, because a lot of schools might teach in the local language. So if I'd stayed in Bengal, I would have had to have Bengali as well as English and Hindi. So that, I think because we're used to dealing with complexity and it is quite normal for us to go from one language to another. I had to learn to curb that when I came to Australia, because you'd suddenly get this, you know, blanks. But my Indian friends there, or people who come from a multilingual, will know what I'm talking about. And I don't think there's a any, because English is one of the 26 official languages. So there's no national language as such. There are 26 official languages. Well, it depends on which Australian. The Aboriginal people will have several languages, and so do the ones from and I think Australian English is again quite different from American English and British English. So each country develops its language and idioms and whatever. I am told that I've preserved some of the Indian English. I think it was because I'm using terms like cousin, brother, but in at least Bengali kinship terminology is extremely precise. You know whether the person is from the mother's side or the father's side, whether they're older or younger. So cousin, aunt, uncle are too vague for us. People have got used to uncle and auntie, which is applied to anyone who's older than you. But cousin is a no-no. So it has to be cousin brother or cousin sister. And so I've used that in the book because that's how they would speak, even when they're speaking in English.
So, as an academic, you really do enjoy researching and writing about certain periods of history. Is there another period of maybe Indian history or world history that you'd like to explore in another book, if given the chance?
Probably post-independence, which is where the daughter comes in. I'm not going back further in time because I did modern Indian history. But 47 onwards was quite I haven't decided where I'll end it. But yes, I'd like to see, and you could say the characters in this book are what you might call the first wave of feminism in India. They're called the nationalist feminists. The second wave of feminism was around the same time as here, and some of the issues were the same and some different. But I'd have to go back and read because some of them were acting and working before I was old enough to even know what a feminist was, or women's rights or whatever. So yes, post-independence, that's 1947. Don't know when it'll finish. It has to be before the characters get too old to be.
Hi, Indrani. Okay. Hi. I was just wondering, have you had an Indian audience read your book, or?
Yes, a few, and there's some sitting at the back. But we did a first launch, what they call a soft launch, on International Women's Day, which is organized, Irene organized one for the Multicultural Radio Group, and we have an Indian Women's Association, and the person who launched it was Archana Singh, who's our honorary consul. She actually grew up in Lucknow, and so that was a good way of testing authenticity. Lucknow is I was born in Lucknow, I never lived there, so it was good to have someone who actually grew up there. And yes, and I've had feedback from some of the Indians as well who bought the book. And as I said, they've all been warned that don't read it. Well, I was born a bit after 1947, so it can't be my story. I'm waiting to see what my relatives overseas think of it, because many of them know Lucknow very well. That's where we met for holidays and things. They know the city, and my great-grandfather had a house and a big rose garden, which is where probably I got the variety of the rose. Yeah, I'm just waiting to hear, but it hasn't been out that long, so. I would say I'd like to thank the Indian media. They've been very generous in providing free coverage and in their newspapers and radio, and it's been good. I would like to have people say that if something isn't authentic, they need to tell me that as well, because I don't need. That's what helps us develop. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering if you were ever thinking of getting it published in your mother tongue.
Unless someone translates it. My mother tongue is Bengali, which is my my first language, but I don't know it well. I learned it at home. In school we did English and Hindi, and we had to do Sanskrit, which was compulsory, which is like doing Latin or Greek here.
Would Hindi be more of a...
It's actually more accessible to different Indians if it's in English, because the kind of people who would read it would be... Now if some Bengali friend wants to translate it, that's fine, but I wouldn't be game to do it.
Do we have any more questions? Well, on behalf of Avid Reader, we'd just like to thank Indrani and Sarah for tonight's talk, and I'll just point out that we have copies of The Rose and Thorn on the counter for sale, and I'm sure Indrani will be more than happy to sign them for you. Thank you.
And thank you all again for coming, and it's starting to spit, so this might be a good time to